I'm a professor of media studies and law at the University of Virginia. I've been invited to Madrid to take part in a conversation on cyber realism, which is an approach to our digital issues and our digital environment that tries not to make big grand claims about historical change or radical shifts in human consciousness, but instead tries to pay attention to the details, to the specificity, to the reality of how we use digital tools in our lives. We use these tools to navigate, we use these tools to explore, to interrogate, to communicate, and we have so many important issues that arise from these new tools in our lives. And so many of us are trying to take on these questions in a mature and focused way rather than declaring grand revolutions at this point in time. I'm the author of a book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry, which takes this very approach. I did my best to understand how we use Google, how and why we use particular digital tools in our lives, and I tried to point out that sometimes we assume too much about the changes that these tools are making in our lives. And so I'm participating in this conversation in Madrid. It's being hosted at Círculo de Bellas Artes in the center of Madrid, and it's a wonderful experience. The Googleization of everything was my attempt to make sense of why we have allowed Google to be the lens through which we view the world. I became very concerned about 5 or 6 years ago that many of us were relying on Google too much. We were dependent on Google. We found it difficult to make it through a week without using Google in some way. That includes everything Google does, not just the search, but Gmail for communicating with each other, or YouTube, which is certainly the most important and ubiquitous way of experiencing video in the world today. None of these particular actions are bad in and of themselves, and nothing Google does is necessarily harmful in and of itself. But the totality of our dependence on Google assumes, first of all, that Google will always be benevolent, will always be good to us. But secondly, assumes that Google will always be here on these terms. And so I wanted to emphasize that Google is only here in the moment. It's a very new company. It's a new phenomenon in our lives. In 5, 10, 15 years, it will be very different. And so I walked through a series of issues, including copyright issues, Google's relationship with books, ultimately Google's troublesome relationship with privacy, the way that Google makes money through advertising and by monitoring so much of what we do. I wanted to look at the fact that Google is such a powerful commercial force on the web that it raises competition problems or antitrust problems, and ultimately look at the ideology that informs Google, the notion that Google is there to make the world better, not necessarily to make money for Google. I think that's a myth. I think it's a bad assumption on our part. On the other hand, I think it's important that we take Google at its word when it talks about trying to engineer our behavior. And I wanted to warn that this may not be the best way to envision a good information ecosystem. So ultimately, I wanted to get readers to understand that depending on Google to do so many important things is probably not a wise move in the long run. Our relationship with Google in the short term is convenient, but not much more than convenient. I've been in Spain for 24 hours, and in this time I've already fallen in love with this country. It is so rich in its history, so aware of its own history. There are so many strong symbols of Spain's greatness over the centuries, and yet a sense of optimism for the future as well. And that comes, of course, at a very difficult time for much of Europe. So I've been fascinated by the spirit and the attitude of people in Spain even during these difficult times. They've been through worse and they've been through so much, and I think even in the first 24 hours of my visit, it's clear that the people of Spain are ready to endure and rise again.